All right, everyone, welcome back to this afternoon session where we're delighted to welcome Barney Afako. Till now, as you know, we've been doing a lot of theory of transitional justice. We've also been speaking with people who move seamlessly and effortlessly between their scholarly world and the world of actual practice, like Tendai. And now we have somebody who has lived, breathed, and practiced transitional justice for a long part of his career. Barney Afako is a Ugandan lawyer. He has vast experience in conflict mediation. He has had a distinguished career in the fields of human rights, refugee law, criminal justice, and transition issues in a number of countries. He's a member of the UN Mediation Support Unit standby team and also a part-time tribunal judge in the UK. I can imagine there's stories to tell even between the contrast between those two institutions. Between 2006 and 2008, Barney was the chief legal advisor to the Southern Sudanese mediation in the Juba peace talks between the government of Uganda and the Lord's Resistance Army. And in that capacity, he developed and drafted the final peace agreement with particular responsibility for the agreement on reconciliation and accountability. These were actually the first efforts where transitional justice issues were addressed in a context where the International Criminal Court was already active. From 2010, he's been an advisor to the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel on Sudan and South Sudan, which was responsible for facilitating negotiations between Sudan and South Sudan on secession issues, and he continues to work with both states on a range of issues. Barney has also provided advice to other peace processes on addressing the past, but in Uganda in particular, he's advised the government and the Amnesty Commission on issues of peace building and reconciliation. It's a total treat to have Barney here with us today, and I will now turn the floor to him for his lecture on reclaiming racial justice.
Thank you very much indeed, Neha, for those kind words, and I would like to thank the European University Institute for this invitation to participate with yourselves in this summer school, in which you are reflecting quite critically on these very important questions of racial justice. And on this occasion, I'm particularly glad that Ruth, my wife, could join me here in Florence as well. Now, race is both an important and difficult subject, as I'm sure you've appreciated anew in the time that you've been here. And therefore, we address it with both a degree of solemnity, but also humility. Humility because it is complex and the answers are not easy, but we also address it bravely because we know that these questions are moral issues and that those who take part in the struggle against racial injustice, essentially on the side of the angels. But let me say at the outset that whenever one talks about race, you are bound to get some things wrong because our understanding is partial, because sometimes we use the wrong phrases and we don't quite grasp the nuances of the situations that we're describing. So let me apologize in advance if in anything that I say I don't quite get it right. I'm going to be making sure that we leave some time at the end for your immediate feedback on anything that I say. It really has been a blight on the history of humanity that differences in our racial makeup, although in DNA terms they really are minuscule, have come to be regarded as defining of human beings, their character, their culture, their worth as individuals, but also as groups. And despite the fact that our societies are increasingly diverse, many of our urban spaces in particular, but countries as well, we have yet to come to terms with this reality of how we manage and live with the diversity of humankind and build a society that is fair. But we need to begin with history, with that history of the failure to manage our diversity. because our collective grasp of that history and the legacies of past injustices is going to be critical to understanding what then we should do to overcome racial injustices today. Because globally, from the Americas to Asia, Australia, Africa, notions of racial superiority have been justified to exclude sections of society, to grab the lands of indigenous peoples, for the appalling treatment of peoples, including the very abhorrent trade in human beings. The colonization and imperial projects, which were at their height, 18th and 19th centuries across the world, were indeed based on a racialized view of the world and the place of certain societies. So European nations, the explorers, their traders, even their missionaries, portrayed their tasks, their missions, and exploits as a civilizing project in which the exploitation and indeed imposition of their way of life and systems was not only seen as justified, but was seen as essential and necessary. So these legacies of the past remain with us today. They continue to shape our world. They explain the unjust and unfair political and economic systems that we have built in individual societies. They account for some of the hierarchies and marginalizations that we are seeing. But if contemporary racial inequalities are rooted in history, it is in the silences about history that we begin to lose the battle for racial justice, where we begin to erase the contributions of the different racial groups and communities in our world to building the world as it is today. Worse than silences, some of these histories have been deliberately rewritten. Whole peoples and their contributions have been airbrushed from our narratives. And therefore, we see today, particularly here in Europe, and I'm going to talk about Europe quite a bit because it's where we are now, the contribution, indeed presence of other peoples over the years, centuries indeed, is seldom acknowledged. Africans and Middle Easterns, as you know, were in Europe over extended periods, but very often that contribution is not acknowledged. Some of these silences also relate, for example, to the contributions of Islamic civilization to global knowledge, as you know, not only in mathematics, but also in the preservation in Arabic of some of the Western classics, including Greek and Roman texts. But if racial injustice is fomented by ignorance or misinformation and fear, then we need to make a conscious effort to ensure that in our acknowledgement, in our histories, we fairly reflect the participation and contribution of all sections of the global community. But how has the world responded to racial injustice? All of us recall the disaster of the Second World War and the excesses there that shocked the conscience of humankind. And after that war, the world took a stand to reaffirm the values that had been trampled upon during that conflict. Therefore, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaimed in 1948, affirmed the equal freedom, dignity, and rights of all members of the human family. But that's an important starting point, affirming that everyone is entitled to all rights without distinction, such as race. 2 years later, in 1950, UNESCO published its seminal report, The Race Question, which I think you have probably been discussing during your time here. It came in the wake of the Holocaust. It denounced the pseudoscience that had been used to justify the elimination of millions of Jews and others. And it sought to repudiate the notion that race had any basis in biology or science. It recognized that racism directly affected millions of human lives and was causing conflicts and suffering. Now, that was in 1950, but in describing the way the world was described then, we quickly realized that some of those concerns persist to this day. UNESCO was also very instrumental in convening the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, fittingly in Durban in a post-apartheid South Africa. Now, so the world continued even then to be facing this phenomenon of racism. And so when the countries of the world convened in Durban, they set out to fashion a comprehensive response that would include policies, actions, and propose concrete measures that would combat racial injustice. So that summit, which ended in a declaration and program of action, recognized that this global phenomenon of racism required a global response based on certain core values, values of equality and non-discrimination. The declaration described the measures for addressing discrimination and identified areas such as employment, health, policing, education. It enjoined states to begin to collect disaggregated data and to conduct additional research in order to better identify the impacts of differential treatment on the basis of race. Now, this Durban summit was in fact built on the foundations of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination of 1965. It is that convention which in Article 1 describes and defines racial discrimination to mean, and I'm going to read it, any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. So quite a comprehensive definition on the face of it. But perhaps missing from that is a focus on the private sphere, where also racism and discrimination, prejudice continues to blight the lives of people, and we'll come back to that question. The convention established an architecture including a committee on the elimination of racial discrimination to help with monitoring, and you've probably been studying those mechanisms. As with other mechanisms for monitoring human rights, they have weaknesses too, because they very much depend on access. They also depend on the cooperation of states. Some of the criticisms of the convention and the work of the committee is that they have been ineffectual in responding to the true scale of racial discrimination. Although there is an individual complaints procedure, not many cases have been successfully taken up and resolved by the committee. So despite these commitments in Durban, the experience of people of color is demonstrably remains that of experiencing bias and discrimination in their everyday lives. Now, 2020 was an important year in many respects, and for a lot of us it will be imprinted in our memories as a time where we mark the before and after. So many of you will probably remember where you were when lockdown decisions were made and you were not able to socialize as before. The COVID pandemic changed the world, and it impacted, and we have to remember how it impacted this country in particular in profound ways. But on the 25th of May 2020 in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, the United States, an African-American man went into a shop where he allegedly produced a fake $20 note. The shop attendant called the police. But what was different about this tragic encounter? I think this time, in a very modern way, a lot of people were around with their cell phones and cameras, so they videoed what was taking place. They didn't only video it, they uploaded it. And thanks to social media and the internet, millions around the world experienced that horrifying spectacle of the life of George Floyd being extinguished under the knee of a white police officer. Perhaps it was the fact that this event took place in the middle of the pandemic, when people were focusing very much on their own mortality, and perhaps there was a greater sense of solidarity and the sense that we're all in this together. Whatever the case was, the outpouring of disbelief and rage was immense, and it was global, and it was sustained. Eventually, a trial followed, but in fact, the significance of this event was bigger than that single trial. In Europe and other parts of the world, the soul-searching continued, and in some cases, it translated into positive outcomes, renewed efforts to address the more local manifestations of racial injustice in the different societies. The legacy of the death of George Floyd illustrates that the struggle for racial justice relies on solidarity of a cross-section of people, because it wasn't only African Americans who took to the streets, it was young white people, it was older brown and other colored people who protested and demanded a different kind of world. But this incident took place in the middle of a pandemic. That pandemic also made plain to us that race was a key determinant of health outcomes. So far from being a leveler, COVID exposed that there were really deadly vulnerabilities in our society, and that ethnic groups and other social groups across the world, United States, Europe, certainly in the UK, where we live, it became apparent that people of color were dying or enduring serious ill health in far greater numbers than the national average. At first, this seemed perplexing, but as the more subtle analysis came to the fore, it became clear that what was happening was that poorer socioeconomic circumstances resulted in ill health and vulnerability. So such comorbidities like high blood pressure and others were predominant in certain communities, and this came to be reflected in the mortality rates. It also demonstrated that certain health systems in the West did not really understand the health situation of certain racial and social groups. They were designed for the dominant community, but not for minorities. So although health workers did their best, systemically, the system failed certain minorities. So the experience with COVID indicates that racially unequal outcomes are a reality and need to be taken seriously by analyzing the data, exploring the causality. So a response to structural impacts, unequal impacts, is different to the immediate response, for example, to the killing of George Floyd on the street. So the explanations had to be explored. Analysts, epidemiologists had to engage with this reality that was undeniable. Along the way, we saw in Europe and other parts of the world as well that xenophobia lurked closely during the pandemic. People of Chinese origin, or indeed simply of Asian-looking, who were Asian-looking, began to be targeted, not only by states, but also by private persons, because quite irrationally, they were associated with the pandemic. And then perhaps more troubling, there was the scandal of the hoarding of vaccines by the rich countries of the world. So while in poorer countries, you could count the number of vaccines that had been made available, in some countries, people were getting the second and even their third vaccinations. So poorer countries who tended to be of other racial groups were waiting in a very long queue while the wealthy helped themselves to vaccines. And even worse, there's a concerted effort to block the access to the patents that would enable vaccines to be produced more cheaply. So in sum, COVID unmasked socioeconomic, political, health inequalities, and that it resulted in worse outcomes, not only for individuals, but also for countries. So we see that racism has persisted, as has broader racial injustice in the world. So even when we return to the United States after the death of George Floyd, it is still quite sobering that 2 years after his murder, the Washington Post's fatal force tracker reports that more than 1,000 people had been killed by police in the year until mid-June 2022. And that Black Americans are killed at more than twice the rate of whites, even though they represent just 13% of the American population. And this pattern is not only in the United States, but across the world. In diverse communities, you see an overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system. They are at once over-policed and under-protected. But even when anti-racism policies are adopted, they are unevenly implemented, or they're inconsistently and selectively implemented. And this is also reflected in the continuing reluctance of some states to collect and disaggregate equality data by race. Moreover, political leaders often fail to provide that leadership on questions of racial justice. In some cases, they instead stoke populist fears and hostility. So problematic racial attitudes are not challenged and called out. So the battle for racial justice is far from over, as we find right-wing extremism and wider populism, there's every reason to remain vigilant. Although we're speaking about racial injustice, it is the reality that for many, they experience overlapping forms of vulnerability and discrimination. So for example, a Black disabled woman is going to carry several burdens of disadvantage concurrently. So this reality of intersectionality means that where a person or group faces multiple injustices, no single injustice should negate the other or relegate the prospect of addressing it. This means that racial injustices in particular should not be subordinated to other injustices, neither should they dominate and push out other injustices that need to be recognized and addressed. So George Floyd's situation put a sharp focus on race and the criminal justice systems of the world. But there are other aspects in the criminal justice system that are troubling, including the heightened concerns about terrorism that we've seen in recent decades, which have led to counterterrorism measures, which include the profiling of minorities and the nationals of certain states and regions. This thinking, this lens, anti-terrorism lens, influences other policies and practices, including in migration and the management of the movement, of the natural movement of peoples. Migration is increasingly criminalized and subjected to ethnic profiling. And we need to find ways of challenging and changing that. I'll come back to migration in a moment. While police brutality and excesses can be caught on camera and uploaded and shown around the world, certain kinds of exclusion and racial injustice are not as amenable to the camera. The bleak reality is that certain racial groups are routinely excluded from active participation in the economy. They find themselves locked out of opportunities for economic activity. In the West in particular, minorities can be shunted towards really unfair and broken labor and other markets, sometimes because of their uncertain immigration status. They're dubbed illegals without any rights in the employment market. The phenomenon of the postcode or zip code lottery is a reality. It means that some neighborhoods, particularly if there's a significant minority component, are more susceptible or more liable to have high insurance premiums. Credit is less available to them because lenders place ceilings on loans, financial services, etc. Companies have also become really adept at shaping the demands of and markets in those communities, marketing particular goods, often inferior goods, in certain communities. This also goes for fast foods, which result in health outcomes that are poorer for black neighborhoods. If you try to rent property as a black person in certain cities, you're likely to experience serious difficulties, and this can be alienating and dispiriting for individuals and families. Many young black people struggle in some countries to have access, equal access to good education and to university places. If you have a distinctively black or non-European name, in some countries this reduces the possibility of being shortlisted or getting a call back from employers. Yet, access to good education is an essential foundation for the improvement of social and economic prospects. An education system that is true to the history and culture of all sections of society, but that also ensures the participation of all peoples is essential for a fair society. Yet minority communities are often routinely denied the best education, and this is not only in Europe or America, but across the world. Some of these disparities are legacies of colonialism and how it defined the role of different groups in the societies that were colonized. In the United States, African Americans are 3 times as likely as whites to be poor. In some neighborhoods, a young black person is more likely to be incarcerated than to graduate from college, and the wealth disparities are also stark. I'll come back to migration. In more recent years, we've seen that the world has seemed to be on the move because of the conflicts in Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. In my work as an immigration judge and also in conflict resolution, you see the impact of conflict in those countries and how they have forced people to move. The same is true of the economic and social hardships in Central America, which has seen caravans of people heading north towards America. In response, states have criminalized migration. So expression an illegal migrant is almost a natural part of the discourse. These policies and the response to migration is clearly shaped by the rise in xenophobia across the world as well. Africa is not immune. Zimbabwe's political crisis forced millions of its nationals to flee the country. Many ended up in South Africa. In more recent years, they've been faced with local resentments and a hardening of positions and moving away from hospitality to foreigners in that country. So even as states have pivoted towards less generous and more restrictive policies, they have failed to publicly concede or to make a strong case that migrants, in fact, are net contributors to their societies, socially and economically. So if these pictures that we're painting are bleak, that is because they reflect the reality and perhaps don't reflect the true extent of racial injustice. And many of you will be able to identify other issues and other societies where there's manifest racial injustice. So where does one start to address this question? In the first place, to recognize that racial injustice manifests not only in overt prejudice and discrimination, but in systems and structures which leave certain sections of the community almost permanently disadvantaged. So in a boring way, one needs to start with statistics. If you are to address racial injustice, you need to play the long game, and you need to play a game that is based on the facts. And the importance of that is so that nobody can contradict with anecdotes what is the reality of thousands and millions in the society. That means that racially disaggregated data is critical because it's powerful in making the case about the existence of inequality, because it's the basis of any sound policy making. Some countries have made a start, and in this regard, while the United Kingdom has been systematically collecting some of the data for some time, many countries don't do so routinely. Indeed, some resist this. So across the globe, where data is accessible, the indicators cannot be denied because they point to the reality that people of color fare worse than others across a number of social and economic indicators. This will not come as news to any of us in this room, but it is essential when making policy that it can be backed up with this kind of probing analysis of the true impacts of racial injustice. So do not advocate that we leave the campaigning to statisticians. It is critical that we respond immediately to overt racism, as in the case of George Floyd. We don't wait for the number crunchers, but to play the long game and to bring about abiding and sustainable changes, we need that to be grounded in the analysis of the facts. And then we turn to the law. What is the place of the law? Whenever the world is faced with a social problem of a large scale, it has tended to turn to lawmaking at both the national and international levels. And we've seen the history of international lawmaking on racial discrimination. Lawmaking is attractive for the political classes because sometimes it helps to demonstrate that something is being done, and sometimes anything suffices. But how effective laws are as legal tools in both identifying, preventing, and responding to racial injustice is the true test, because it is easy to respond to direct racial discrimination. It is more complicated to tackle indirect racial consequences. So law is undoubtedly crucial because it sets standards, it reflects the values of society. However, much of the law that has been developed on racial injustice has fixated on this question of discrimination. So it's looking for evidence of bad faith or intention. We need something that is more nuanced. Because as we say, there are other forms of racial injustice, including in the private sphere, which are much more difficult to criminalize. So part of our conclusion may be that the law is a necessary but not a sufficient tool for dealing with racial injustice, and that law should go hand in hand with policies, but also with education, so that we raise our future generations, including our children, not to abandon the idea that diversity is a good thing, and that we live our lives in society on the basis of fairness. So we should certainly outlaw all forms of discrimination, but we should also subject the very content of law to the test of whether it serves all people of all colors and social groups equally. And in that regard, we may discover that there are aspects of the law which produce profoundly unequal outcomes. So while one cannot legislate for private solidarity, a society can pursue policies that reward and enhance cooperation and coexistence, that maximize opportunities for all. They can also put in place systems and measures to detect and address systemic disadvantages. So not just complaints about individual racism, but also complaints about structures that yield unequal outcome. So lawmaking needs to be based on a deep understanding of the nature and challenge of racial injustice. We may need more law, but we also need law that understands its limits and that can be catalytic, creating spaces for other processes that can better respond to racial injustice. So the response to racial injustice at the global level has continued. In particular, one has to say that Europe did respond to the events of 2020 by beginning to review how it was dealing with the question of racial injustice. For the European Union, since we're in a European Union space, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights also prohibits discrimination on the grounds of race, among others. The EU has elaborated that prohibition in the form of the Race Equality Directive of 2000. That directive covers a range of fields, identifies areas of employment, occupation, vocational training, membership of employer-employee organizations, social protection, a whole range of areas, including healthcare and education and access to housing, as areas where it is important, necessary for states to create mechanisms to ensure that they are free of racial discrimination. It also requires all member states to create a specialized body to promote equal treatments on the grounds of race and ethnic origin. So while the directive has been transcribed into law in many member states, the problems are far from over. Its application, as we saw with the convention, international convention, has been uneven. But come 2020, the EU Commission adopted the European Anti-Racism Action Plan in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the protests that followed. This plan recognizes the need to address institutional and structurally racialized outcomes and engages with the role of legislation in that regard. It concedes that racial injustice indeed permeates all aspects of society, and it tries to examine those differentials in those areas, including health, migration, gender, digital access and spaces. It also considers the risks associated with technologies, including artificial intelligence. You've probably all followed discussions about how algorithms can have inbuilt biases against minorities, because it very much depends on who writes it and what assumptions they bring to that exercise. Some of the principles and actions proposed by the EU really represent what is a holistic and more comprehensive approach, certainly at the level of aspiration. Among other things, it advocates developing definitions of direct and indirect discrimination and harassment. It focuses on victims of discrimination, giving them a right to complain to judicial or administrative bodies. Innovatively, it seeks to transfer the burden of proof to the respondent in civil and administrative cases to disprove discrimination once a victim has established certain necessary facts. However, these issues that Europe is grappling with are replicated manifold in other parts of the world. And so there are common lessons upon which we should reflect. Firstly, racial injustice is a complex phenomenon and needs to be tackled at multiple levels, including the personal, not just limited to the public space, and to look at both structural and systemic forms of injustice. The Puerto Rican sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva has described what he calls racism without racists, which I think is a simple and powerful way to make the point, a point that is often missed, that a society should not just focus on racial prejudice, but should focus on impacts that racial injustice might result from the actions or inactions of people of goodwill. So an important and powerful point to remember. It's therefore essential to continue this focus on conduct and attitudes of individuals, but equally critical to confront the true nature and complexity of systemic and structural racial injustice. So racism doesn't only come with a swastika tattoo or wearing a white hood. It's insidious, and you probably detect it long after it has infected the society and begins to produce inequalities. So although those who exhibit racial prejudice should be continually called out, certainly shamed, even prosecuted, importantly assisted to change their attitudes, our understanding of the systemic and structural nature of racial injustice should impel us and the state to focus on outcomes without being overly preoccupied with labels. But we should also make provision for victims, those who suffer racial injustice should be afforded appropriate redress, and their experience should be acknowledged. And that's often the first step in reparations. Secondly, tackling injustice is much more than dealing with prejudice. It also must encompass promoting positive attitudes, promoting the idea that diversity and tolerance is critical for society. And in this regard, education is crucial from a very young age, indeed from the family setting, so that values of tolerance, respect, and coexistence are instilled and sustained, and that as young people grow up, they have these positive experiences of living with others respectfully. Thirdly, states are critical actors, and indeed they're the ones who sign international instruments. But while state interventions are a necessary element in our response to racism, we've seen that the mobilization of private actors, including civil society, is essential to catalyze change. So we do need in our society to protect the space for protest and not to shut it down, and not to shut down movements and organizations, including organizations like Black Lives Matter, which commit themselves to fight for racial justice. And in so doing, we also need to recognize that not everybody will want to wear a label when they resist racial injustice. It is the duty of every citizen and member of society to do so. Fourthly, we have to recognize, coming back to law and policy, that law is a critical tool. There's a caveat. International law is difficult to make. The process of introducing and agreeing treaties is dominated by states. You're unlikely to have many new treaties in the near future. So a lot of the focus needs to be at the national level, finding creative ways of ensuring that racial injustice is outlawed at the national level. In this regard, some states have already created specific crimes, and including racial motivation as an aggravating feature of certain crimes. But it's not only the criminal law that states should respond, but also other areas, including ensuring access and sometimes preferential treatment for members of certain groups until their experience and opportunities have been equalized. I'll come to transitional justice. I know that this conference has been discussing the question of race and transitional justice, and I'm sure that your conversations have been lively and interesting. One of the things about transitional justice over the years as it has developed is that it has become, in my view, overly fixated on the past, and particularly in its emphasis on criminal justice. It has become very focused on the role and responsibility of individuals for certain types of crimes. And in this process, it runs a risk of losing an important opportunity to address what is structurally wrong with society. Because some of the harms that cause oppression, that cause conflict, are structural in nature. They're of a societal and political nature, and they drive some of the contestations and injustices within the society. Whether this is entrenched ethnic marginalization, in some cases a racial architecture, as in South Africa, transitional justice should have a response. It does not need to have the full answers. What it can do is to provide the opportunity and forum for a discourse, because the absence of a discourse plays very directly into the continuance of racial injustice. So I would see transitional justice as providing that opportunity for society to confront its demons, to confront what is structurally wrong with it, and to begin the process of identifying ways of overcoming injustice. So transitional justice is not comfortable. It's drifting too much into the area of the good and evil. So we are the good people targeting individuals, and can very easily lead to the conclusion that what is wrong with society is a handful, usually of men, who make terrible decisions and unleash suffering on others. But in fact, in the questions of race and racial injustice, we're all implicated in one way or the other, if not by our actions, I hope not our actions, but our inactions, our failure to recognize the differential harms to others. So transitional justice for the 21st century really should seek to be catalytic of processes and policies and actions that will begin to better understand, if not fully address, inequalities, including of race. And I believe that transitional justice is properly placed to do this because it's not really a legal instrument. It's a field that uses law, but it's nimble, so it can afford to be creative. In the processes that I've been involved with on transitional justice, I've seen the tendency to focus on mechanisms and institutions. But in fact, we should reconceive of transitional justice as playing the long game. So for example, I work with the Lord's Resistance Army negotiations, we didn't really do justice to the question of how to address the perceived marginalization of the people of northern Uganda, which was on the table. In Sudan, and the discussions with southern Sudan, they didn't really address the question of the years of what one side perceived as oppressive behavior by the other group. And you can tick off the situations where there have been missed opportunities to address the questions of race. So if we've been rather bleak in our remarks, it's only because we're trying to be as realistic as possible, in the hope that we comprehend some of the damage that racial injustice inflicts on society. Let's face it, it's alive. It's alive and very well in some parts of the world. And therefore we need to commit to a very long, arduous fight, which will necessarily be intergenerational. We will not complete that in this generation, but we need to leave the next generation with better tools, better honed methods, ways of analysis, understandings of this very insidious character of racial injustice. So it will need concerted efforts, certainly at the national, regional, international level, but very, very importantly, in the private spheres as well, both at the civic level, but also in homes and communities. So unfortunately, our very deep revulsion and abhorrence of racial injustice is not sufficient. In fact, it's not shared by very many. And that's why we have to enlist not only the like-minded, but also those who may consider themselves completely untouched by prejudice, either as victims or perpetrators. So we need champions to develop and hone our tools. We need lawyers, like many of you here, who will improve the content and understandings of the law and find new ways that we could use the law to address racial injustice. At the structural level, again, we need policies that will be equal to unmasking the more subtle manifestations of racial injustice. So attaining this goal of sustained and effective action against racial injustice will necessarily be incremental, will require vigilance, and it will be necessary to sustain difficult discussions and learn and unlearn ways of doing things. So the point of all of this is not just to make you better analysts of racial injustice, but better catalysts of racial justice. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Barney, for that illuminating long history of global efforts to address racial injustice and also a diagnosis of why they have been so unsuccessful throughout the course of history, but also now, post-2020, post the watershed moment. And also for the reminder that racial injustice does not always come breathing fire and brimstone, but that it lurks in unexpected corners ranging from vaccine racism to the securitization of migration, so places where we may not look as obvious candidates for addressing some of these embedded practices of racial injustice. And also, again, for the reminder that rectifying racial injustice is not simply something that states can do. It's not simply something that lawyers can do, statisticians can do, though they rarely get credit for it, but also something that's our common responsibility and our common project. We have half an hour for questions, so any questions to be addressed to Barney, I can moderate and keep a queue, including the folks online, though I will have to figure out how to manipulate the screen so I can see your hands, your electronic hands. All right, so Khair Tuli will help us do that, given the fact that I'm a Luddite. All right, so let's begin with the room and also the folks online. Kertali is keeping charge. I apologize, I can't quite see necessarily your names, but please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm Sarah. I wanted to, you mentioned in your talk now the idea of, again, the multiple conscious, that of a black woman who's also disabled. How can the law interact with individuals who have multiple obstacles to their access to justice without it being overly too narrow? Because I think that is an issue that the law faces. If we go too narrow, will it make it futile? Or if we leave it open, is it too complex?
Perhaps one way is to develop modalities, mechanisms that merge the responses. So instead of having an anti-racism czar, an anti-gender discrimination czar separately and a disability one, so that the complainant has to go thrice through the procedure, maybe the procedural answer is that we develop mechanisms that are one-stop, that don't leave any issues out of consideration. We're beginning to see this in the better management of justice systems, is that complainants are encouraged to list all of their issues so that you attempt to deal with everything at once. It frees up. This is for administrative purposes. It frees up the capacities of the courts. But that's not being done uniformly, partly because these mechanisms have been introduced piecemeal and therefore have been conceived of as having an existence of their own. But that's one practical way that we could deal with it. But you already have a chapeau in terms of the principle of equality and non-discrimination that cuts across a lot of categories where law outlaws non-discrimination. So in terms of a remedy, and I think I hear your question as targeting that point, in terms of a remedy, perhaps we should then also develop, if you like, remedies that don't need to be replicated if someone, a complainant, suffers more than one form of harm. But it's also relevant in our discourses that we perhaps need to merge our discourses that promote equality. In education as well, when we're teaching our young people to be respectful, we're not going to have a lesson simply on race, but actually gender and other elements are critical as well. So we should conceive of our policies, syllabuses with intersectionality in mind. And I would like to suggest that the principle of equality gives us an adequate chapeau to enable that to happen, that there will be no contradiction in addressing more than one issue at once. But I concede that for practical purposes, sometimes for impact, you need to take a single issue forward in order to effect that change. But that change doesn't have to look like the single issue. It can be broadened out. Thank you.
More questions on the room? I have Tendai, and then online folks, please pipe up too. Tendai. No, I can't. So, yeah. Please go ahead, and then after you, Nina, who I see a raised hand, and after you, though. So just to very briefly and roughly restate Tendai's question for the folks online, the question is whether ignoring race or racial injustice is a bug, is a feature rather than a bug of our systems, including our system of transitional justice.
Thank you. And difficult questions that, because when it comes to borders and migration, if you step back and ask yourself, why are borders closed? Is it because states and governments are afraid that socially, in the composition of their society, their citizens do not accept or will resist incomers? So is it driven by impulses, by national impulses, or is there another agenda at play? I agree that borders have been hard borders from their inception. In fact, the European Union project went the other direction in removing barriers to freedom of movement. But even when it did, it became clear, certainly when the United Kingdom was part of the EU, that there were serious reservations about that policy. And indeed, it is a perceived mismanagement of migration that did fuel the decisions that ended up with Brexit. So although I'm inclined to think that borders are naturally hard borders, they're there to exclude rather than to invite people in, as a lawyer, I have faith in legal systems operating even in unjust contexts. So even if you don't have global justice, macro justice, law permits micro justice, but law is not sufficient for macro justice. That is the realm of politics. And that's why we're saying that you've got to win the argument about soft borders. And that's a political case. The law can't make that case. So political leaders, civic leaders, a lot of them are doing this, and education systems should underscore the contribution and value of hospitality to others. I come from Uganda. We have a basically open-door refugee policy. And there is perhaps 2 million plus refugees in Uganda. Refugees are not encamped. They can live in the community. They can choose to live where there's provision by UNHCR. It's a deliberate political choice to make. And part of the explanation for that choice is that historically, Uganda did support liberation movements across its borders, and so saw it as its duty to receive and host those who were fleeing from the consequences of those actions. Now, that's different to other countries, but the difference is the politics of it. So it's not the law. In fact, the law doesn't require Uganda to have that open policy. It will be very much within its rights to insist that all refugees have to stay in refugee settlements. That will be consistent with international law and other regional instruments on refugees. I'll give you another example. In the negotiations between Sudan and South Sudan, in which I was involved, on the question of whether what would happen to citizens after the secession of the South. This was about 10 years ago. We were part of that facilitation exercise. The hardest, most difficult conversations were around this question, because obviously Sudan was aggrieved, in a sense, politically, that the South wanted to break away. And so there were some on both sides of the argument who were arguing for hard border. And it took a lot of political pressure to get the parties to agree that they would have a soft border between Sudan and South Sudan. And it fell to me to define what this soft border was. And the tool that we used was the 4 freedoms, reimagined for Sudan and South Sudan. So freedom to move, freedom to own property, freedom to have employment, etc. It was actually borrowed from a similar agreement between Sudan and Egypt. This is to make the point that it had to be the politics first before it was reduced into an agreement. But even when the agreement was signed, the 2 states didn't live up to that commitment of a soft border. We're only just beginning to realize that. But luckily, we have a text and a mechanism for doing that. So that's the role that law plays. Absent of 4 freedoms and soft border agreement, you've got no legal basis, if you like, for promoting this. So sometimes law has to appear unrealistic because it's investing in the politics changing minds and making it more relevant further down the line. So yes, borders are hard, and laws are progressively getting restrictive and uncomfortable for practitioners and migrants to navigate. But if you work backwards to your principles, equality, non-discrimination, etc., we have to keep going back to those principles and reimagine how they respond to the migrant crisis. But the battle isn't legal. The battle is political. The battle is social. If you don't win in those spheres, the law was neither here nor there. But even when everything is restrictive, you can have micro justices, micro victories within that. And that's what a lot of the immigration adjudication systems are about. A small anecdote, I know Tendai, you know South Africa quite a bit. Under apartheid, as you can imagine, the whole law was iniquitous. It supported apartheid. But to be a good human rights lawyer in South Africa, you had to really be competent and procedural law and in the details of how the system functioned. So human rights lawyers didn't do substantive law. They became very good at procedural matters, at knocking out cases on technicalities, of holding that system to account even by its limited standards. And so they had some victories, but they were not macro victories, they were micro victories. So don't stay away from iniquitous systems. Sometimes you need to be part of it. Not everybody should. Some should keep a distance from those systems. So that's the difference between the macro and the micro, and the difference between political, social, and the limits of law. So the limits of law are conceded, but there are some benefits that the law can deliver. Transitional justice. I think that transitional justice has the possibility of reimagining itself simply because it is not encumbered by too many rules. It does not have to change society. It can be catalytic. It's as much an opportunity to have a conversation and begin to define the outlines of where the solutions might lie. It is easy to be seduced by results and solutions. So that's why a trial is very attractive. You have a verdict at the end of it. Even Truth Commission, the report is there and a list of recommendations, and nobody really looks at it. But what if we conceived of transitional justice as process of discourse and conversation that would be ongoing, at least for a sustained period, to address the deep challenges of society, which would not only involve non-state actors, not just a commission, but all of society and the state to grapple with these issues outside of the legislative process. Because normally we leave policy to parliaments to make. But what if the contribution of transitional justice was to take those decisions out of the legislative process and to discuss them and mature them and internalize them and adopt values as a society that the legislature and other arms of government could then adopt. And maybe that might help us with initiatives that address racial injustice. Because otherwise you'll be able to pick out one or two laws to strike down perhaps, and then it's cosmetic because it doesn't anticipate the lurking injustices that will only surface when there's a crisis, just as it did over COVID.
Thank you. So then I have Nina online.
Yeah, thank you. You actually, your answer now touched upon my question, but now I have another question connected to that that came in. So you mentioned in your presentation, and you just mentioned now again, the possibility of transitional justice to reimagine itself because it's a more flexible and creative framework than other legal framework. But I was wondering, what, in your opinion, what will be the setting necessary to arrive? Because this framework exists and it's like flexible and can be creative. But to my opinion, so far, we have come up a bit with classical solution. We haven't arrived yet to this process of ongoing discussion. So what will be the necessary condition or the setting that will enable transitional justice to reimagine itself and going that way?
And I think, in a sense, you have provided part of the answer. Is first of all to accept and concede that these sort of classical pillars, reparation, truth here, and criminal justice and others, are not sufficient. So it's a dissatisfaction with the status quo without repudiating it. Let's continue to do all the things we are doing, but when it comes to issues like racial injustice, let's make the point that this is more subtle than hitherto we have thought, that this is not just about racism and prejudice. This is about a rethink of attitudes. This is about interrogating outcomes of policies that on their face are innocuous. And for that, you need different tools. And you need to persuade, you need to engage states and state actors, and also in the private spheres, companies whose practices sometimes yield these negative outcomes. So you're not just targeting the state. This is what transitional justice does. It runs to the state and hopes that if you change the state and policy, things will be all right. It won't be all right in the case of racial injustices, because it thrives in the private, even personal spheres as well. And the state can't make that go away with legislation or policing. So you see, you have a different kind of problem once you start thinking like that. The answers are for us to imagine, but let's define the problem correctly and say that it is unlike some of the challenges that transitional justice has been addressing. Otherwise, you end up with this situation, for example, in South Africa, where apartheid is over, but de facto segregation continues. You've wrapped up your Truth Commission with a report, but what are the ways to deal with this? You can't just leave it to the state to develop those policies. You need a more active interaction with citizens and others to come up with the answers. And you need commitments not only from the state, but from non-state actors, particularly economic ones, as well, for there to be meaningful change. You also need changes in individuals and their attitudes, and those take a long time. They need different methods as well. So yes, let's keep asking and probing and testing transitional justice, and I'm sure some of you will come up with the answers in your practice in the years ahead.
We have time for maybe one or two last few questions, if anybody in the room or again online had any. Great, thanks.
Hello. Yeah, I'm wondering to ask what we need to do. I feel that we all fail. The UN fail, we fail to change the situation sometimes. And in Israel, I'm from Palestine, Israel. I live in the desert. And every year, the Israeli soldier, the police kill tens of children and Palestinians. In America, in the US, same situation. The police and the soldier kill blacks, and we demonstration in the street for days. Then we continue our life, like what's happened last month with the Al Jazeera journalist. The Israel killed Shireen Abu Akleh in the West Bank, in Jenin. We demonstration in the street for days, then we continue our life. The soldiers continue the work, the police continue the work. They again and again kill us. And we are all fail. The UN fail, the people fail, the blacks fail, the Palestinians fail. And I think that we need some strategical plan to work on that, because we all the time like מגיבים, באנגלית? Response after they kill us and response. They kill us and response. And what you think that we need to do if the UN fail and we fail? Thank you.
I think, unfortunately, we have to go back to the very people who have failed, because there are no other actors out there other than the people who are caught up in those situations where the events you're describing occur, other than the states, other than the regional bodies, other than the partner states, international community. All of us have to do better. I think this conversation would have been, for me, would have been even more despondent if 2020 hadn't happened. What we saw arising from what happened in the United States was this mobilization that a lot of us had thought was no longer possible. And what was encouraging was how it went across divides and how young people were really engaged on these issues. So we need to find ways of putting all injustices everywhere on the agenda. But reality is that sometimes it takes an emblematic case, and you never know what is going to be the emblematic case. George Floyd wasn't the only victim around that time. There'd been others. It didn't capture the imagination. So hard work, doing the things that we have been doing to protest, even using the mechanisms that have failed us previously, because it's by the attritional nature of not letting go questions of injustice that eventually we'll begin to see possibly changes, maybe not drastic changes, maybe incremental ones. That's why I don't advocate for abandoning law, that you chip away at it, you bring a challenge. Sometimes it's buried in the files for years, but you force a judge to rule on it, so that everybody can read, what they say about this situation and what direction they're taking the jurisprudence. So I would say, hard as it is, we mustn't despair. Because who wins? When we give up, injustice wins. So we have to keep mobilizing on that. And it's dispiriting, it's discouraging, particularly when one feels that they don't have allies on these causes. And then that also means that others who are not in the situation should raise these issues. Governments should have conversations. They don't all have to be public conversations. No doubt some of these are taking place. But it's only by making a stand on these issues to say that injustice anywhere diminishes all of us. You're talking about Palestine. There are other parts of the world where you're not even allowed, to put it on the agenda without repercussions. So we need to still aim for a world where nothing is off limits to discuss and to debate and to interrogate the morality of it and to challenge those who might be responsible and eventually to bring them to account. For me, it's most important that attitudes and ways of living together change. The politics are important. Often it's because there are no viable political solutions that you have this perpetual cycle of injustice continuing. So somebody needs to ask, what is the end game on the Israeli-Palestinian situation? It's not sustainable, but what is it? And the political people should revisit that as well, because it's part of preventing the political responses and the rage and the protest. Thank you.
So we're out of time, and to echo what Barney said perhaps in the lecture more extensively, it is about perhaps the long game, and even if we fail and continue to fail, maybe we'll just have to learn how to fail better before we can have real change. So we're out of time. Thank you again, Barney, for that lecture. Thank you all for your engagement. I think this deserves another round of applause, and then we can go out for lunch. Thank you.